Welcome to another edition of GW Unspoken, where we discuss stuff we don't typically talk about but probably should. And we're here with another special guest, well, a returning special guest, David Gillespie. How are you?
Yeah, good to be here, Gary.
Hey, thanks very much for joining in again. I know it's been a couple of weeks, but I can certainly say that there's been some definite responses since our last podcast. A lot of teachers came up to me going, oh my gosh, I didn't know half of those things that you guys were talking about. So it's starting to make an impact already, which is great.
All right, excellent.
So, yeah, I was hoping that, and I'm really grateful that obviously that you're here talking about the things that we talk about, especially screen addiction. I just wanted a bit of a follow-up episode, I suppose, if that's okay. Just about some questions and answers, if that's all right, just some quick fire ones to you. I know you're a busy man, and but it'd be great just to hear from your research what some of these answers might be to help other people out there as well.
Sure.
All right. So really quickly, the first one I was going to ask you was, you said the last time it takes the Delta Phos B time to reset, and you're saying usually around any addictions around 3 months. Is that really the only answer out there for people who are struggling with their kids and their teens, especially on the addiction to the device?
Yes, it is, but there is another way to do things, and I fear I'm not certain what we got to last time, but one of the things you can do is, like with any addiction, you can use a substitute that's less powerful. So many people will be familiar with that, in terms of methadone and things like that, where it's still an addictive substance, but it has a less powerful dopamine surge associated with it than the thing it's trying to break, which in that case is heroin. The research is out a bit on whether that actually works, but in that what tends to look like is happening is you just become addicted to the alternate thing. And people say, is that like nicotine patches? And the same theory applies to nicotine patches, the idea being that, well, instead of getting the nicotine hit from the cigarettes, which have a lot of bad things associated with them that have nothing to do with the nicotine, when you inhale smoke, which is aldehydes, it causes lung cancer, causes heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. So the theory is, well, let's just give them the nicotine, which is the thing they're addicted to, and then give them a program where they can moderate down the dose of the nicotine. And the theory being that if you get smaller and smaller dopamine hits, over time, you should reduce the Delta Phos B levels and therefore reduce the addiction. I've got to say the research on this is not overly convincing. Okay. There is some interesting research that suggests that there are ways to produce dopamine hits doing things which are otherwise extremely healthy. And I think we talked a little bit about that last time, where, for example, if your child can play a musical instrument, then doing that requires them to focus so hard, because it's not an easy thing to do, that the focus asks your body to produce, dopamine as well. And so it's the same theory. Instead of the dopamine hit coming from something like social media or gaming or gambling or porn, they're getting it from having to focus so hard to do something like play music. Same thing applies to kids who are into sport, obviously. And there's, there's a reason that there's something called a runner's high. So people refer to a runner's high, and that's people who do lots of running. Every day they're running kilometres and kilometres, and they appear to become addicted to it, in that they really get stressed if they can't do it. They miss a day, they can't go to the gym, or they can't go running, or whatever it is. And that's because it is addictive. The body produces endorphins, which is a type of morphine, and you become addicted to it because it produces a dopamine onflow. But there are worse things in the world to be addicted to. And so the idea is that what you might do is, instead of doing something that's providing a cheap dopamine hit, like, the things we were talking about, do something that provides that, is an expensive dopamine hit, in that you also have to do something else to make it happen. And so running, sport, playing a musical instrument, those sorts of things are likely strategies that would help you get through while that Delta Phos B is resetting.
Yeah, okay. And I suppose along with that is things like, it would be like melatonin, getting enough sleep, your diet, obviously all those things too. Would that have an impact to help your brain be healthy to be able to do those things as well?
Well, sleep's an interesting one because sleep's good for lots and lots of reasons, and we could probably do a whole episode about sleep because I found it fascinating, but I've never actually written much about it. But I've done quite a bit of research on it. But let's cut to the bit that's associated with dopamine. So sleep, or the lack of it, is actually your body, which is a lot smarter than you, knows that a good way to get a dopamine hit is to keep you awake. So the body produces more dopamine when it's tired, and that kind of makes sense a bit in that you need to be more alert as other functions start to decline as you get more and more tired.
Yep.
So the body's way of creating a dopamine hit is to keep you awake. So it's usually a really good indication that someone is an addict is if they have trouble sleeping. Because the body's searching for that dopamine hit that, so the addiction has produced a requirement at such a high level that the body's searching for any dopamine hits it can get. And so one of the easy ones for the body to get is just to keep you awake. So that is often, and quite a bit of recent research has identified this as an interesting early identifier of depression and anxiety, is that a couple of years before there's any obvious symptoms, for example, of depression or anxiety in teens, the first sign that there's going to be a problem is sleep problems. So unable to get to sleep, unable to stay asleep, is usually a sign that the body is trying to produce dopamine to make up for the dopamine deficit because the tolerance level is now so high because of the addiction. And so the science is now bearing that out and saying, well, sure. And if you track those people 2 years down the track, you'll find that they are often becoming diagnosed with anxiety and depression, which is the consequence of addiction.
And on the back of that, isn't it, aren't we naturally going through our teenage years, don't we go to sleep later because of that? Because our body's trying
We do.
Yeah.
So this is not to be confused with something that happens normally in teen years, which is that our brain adjusts from a normal. So during the course of the 10 years from the start of puberty to the early 20s, our brain will shift our bedtime, our go to sleep time by about 2 hours. So if a child was used to going to sleep, say at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., when they were 12 or prepubescent, you could expect by the time they're in their early 20s that normal sleep time would shift back 2 hours, regardless of what the child was or was not doing. It would shift back 2 hours. Now, that does not mean they sleep less. It just means they sleep in. So anyone who's had anything to do with a teenager would bear that out. Yeah. And there's quite a movement in the US actually to change the start time of school for teenagers to take account of this. And look, there's some good science behind this. There's nothing controversial about saying this. It's a known fact. Is that the teenage brain does shift the sleep cycle back 2 hours. And so that's not to be confused with the other thing I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is problematic sleeping. So when you would normally be preparing to go to sleep, whatever time that is, you just can't. And that's the body keeping you awake for the dopamine hit.
Yeah, right. How about this for a question? What about if your teenagers are not, for example, on social media, why do they have to still walk past and touch the phone? I'm just seeing what the time is. I'm just seeing if there was a message. I'm just seeing is that just a natural inquisitive behaviour, or is there something in the phones that still?
No, it depends what else is on the phone. I guarantee you they wouldn't do that if it wasn't a smartphone. Right. If it's just a dumb phone that all you can do on it is make telephone calls and receive texts, they'd probably still do it if it could receive text because they were just checking if someone's texted them. But you've got to remember, messaging apps are just as addictive as social media. So saying a kid isn't on social media but they're still on messaging messaging apps are highly addictive because of the random and uncertain nature of the messaging. So often a messaging app is a group, so if you and I were having a telephone call, which is what we're doing right now, it's you talking to me and me talking to you. I don't need to check on anything. We're having a conversation. But if this were happening via a messaging app, then, maybe you'd reply in a minute, maybe you'd reply in an hour, maybe you'd reply tomorrow. And that uncertainty about the reply is a known dopamine exaggerator. So it was actually discovered in the 1940s, I think, with some interesting experiments they did with pigeons, where they did something that the pigeon regarded as a reward. Gave it food or whatever if it pressed a lever. But then what they did is they introduced an uncertainty sequence to it, where pressing the lever would still give the reward, but the amount of time between when the lever was pressed and when the reward was given would vary enormously. And they found in measuring the dopamine surges that the uncertainty approximately doubled the dopamine hit that was achieved from the same action. Wow. So uncertainty is a big part, and it's one that's used by the social media companies to powerful effect. So the doom scroll is used by them in this way. So most social media, like I don't know if you can remember what Facebook was like in, say, 2008, 2009, before Instagram came about. Facebook didn't have a scroll. It didn't have a newsfeed scroll, and then it introduced one, but it was really just stuff that your friends were saying about themselves. And if they put it up there, you saw it. It was sort of like a notice board. If you were following them, then you saw everything they posted. And then they discovered the power of uncertainty and the doom scroll. So and converted into what you've got now, where Facebook shows you lots of things in the feed. Some of them are from people you follow, some of them are from people they follow, some of them are from people you've got no idea who they are. But the Facebook has learned from your behavior what you like to look at, what you pause on, what you stay with, what videos you click on, what photos you click on, etc. And it knows, okay, to keep this person interested, what we have to do is give them something they like, and then 3 things they don't like, and then something they like, and then 10 things they don't like, and then something they like, and then 1 thing they like, and then 2 things they like. And so that variation and uncertainty is what keeps people on a doom scroll, so that you keep going in the hope that the next thing that comes up is something you like.
That's crazy. That's all built in the algorithms of the
absolutely
user.
And none of this is by accident. None of it. It is all very, very intentional and designed to addict.
So, David, are you then saying that if, say, I'm catching out students messaging each other on their laptops in different classes, whatever, that can be just as addictive as social media?
Absolutely. Messaging apps are highly addictive. And the process that I talked about before, where it's just a conversation between you and I, that can be addictive because of the timing uncertainty. But imagine that you do that in a group chat where there's 10, 20, 50 people in there. They're all posting things. Some of them are interesting, some of them are not. You don't know what's going on. Tuning into that is why your kids are checking their phone.
Right. Well, I didn't know that. I thought it was more the social media was like way more, like I suppose more intense and changing neural pathways a lot faster.
No, it's all designed, but that's because people our age or my age or your age think of messaging in a more old-fashioned way. We think of messaging in a one-to-one context, or say an email and a response, or a text message and a response, rather than a continuous live experience, which is the only kind of messaging that a teenager today knows.
Wow, that's I didn't know that. That's interesting. What about, Dave, what about general laptop use? What about, for example, Dave Gillespie's doing his normal 12, 14-hour day, and he's doing some research and he's doing starting to type up his next book. Does that become, I know that's a work example, but does that become addictive too, using the laptop for work?
It depends what you're doing with it. So, it's trite to say that I don't think anyone's addicted to Excel. But, it depends what you're doing with it, in the sense that there is a state of human consciousness which is often referred to as the flow, which is what I'd call absolute concentration. So where you're so focused on whatever you're doing, whether it's on a laptop or any other place, that you exclude everything else. So you are in the flow. You're totally focused on the thing. Now, I certainly experience this when I'm writing, not all the time, but sometimes when I've just get hit on a vein of something that I've just got exactly how to say it. And when you're in that flow state, hours can go by and you have no sense of it whatsoever because you're so utterly focused on what's going on. And you might find it when you're editing, for example, or when you're writing, and this is what a person who plays a musical instrument experiences when they really get into it and start playing. So that state of flow can happen anywhere, including on a computer with a spreadsheet, if that's your thing. But as a general rule, these apps are not written with addiction in mind, and there's nothing about the way they're coded to create addiction. That's something we're creating ourselves in the way we use a tool to enter the flow.
Right.
But once again, that's more of a cure to addiction than a creation of addiction.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think there's anything called PowerPoint Addicts Anonymous or anything like that. It doesn't happen.
No, definitely not for teacher preparation anyway. What about is there other variables that can influence our addiction? So, for example, if you've got naturally, I don't know, sedentary behaviour, poor sleep, we talked about poor nutrition, high sugar foods. If you've got a lack of purpose,
well, sugar produces a dopamine hit. Yep. Sugar is addictive. It's trite to say that food with sugar in it sells better than food without sugar in it, which is why it's put in food. If they could get away with putting cocaine in food, they would do that too, but they can't, so sugar will have to do. But sugar is addictive. We know how it's addictive. It produces a cortisol surge, which in turn produces a dopamine surge. And anything that produces a dopamine surge, any substance which does it, is addictive. So, we have the word chocoholic in the English language for a very good reason, because people are addicted to chocolate. Now, anyone who's ever tasted cocoa without the sugar will tell you there is nothing addictive about cocoa. It tastes like dirt. But add sugar to it and the magic happens. And so, milk chocolate is about half sugar, and that's addictive. And so is everything else that contains sugar. So yes, consuming sugary foods is an addictive behavior. Yeah, and it was interesting. When I first started writing about sugar, I spoke to an Aboriginal man who ran an addiction rehab centre in the Northern Territory, and he was telling me about the methodology that he used to break alcohol addiction. And he was saying to me that one of the first things he had to do in his rehab centre was make sure that people first broke their addiction to sugar. Wow. So he would have all the Coca-Cola removed, all the sugary treats, everything, so that they had to break their addiction to sugar before he would even attempt to break the alcohol addiction. He said if he didn't do that, he had no chance breaking the alcohol addiction.
Wow. And this is probably another podcast, hopefully, about sugar, because I know last time we briefly was talking about that at the start of the podcast, because my wife read Sweet Poison and I was on the Audible and I couldn't find it on there, and we cleaned the garage out today and lo and behold, the book is there, and Rachel's like, I want to read it again. I want to read it again because I am actually, like you're talking about, I'm actually addicted to chocolate. And she's like, can you just ask David tonight, is it okay if I have like a high in cocoa? Like, is that better than just normal milk chocolate, or do I have to go 3 months cold turkey?
It is better, but the trouble with chocolate is, I think you can, and I think people do. I've certainly had friends who've weaned off by going with higher and higher cocoa amounts. So your average milk chocolate's about 50% sugar, 50% cocoa. And if you go to those higher chocolates, so there's things from Lindt, for example, that get up, I think as high as 90% cocoa. There's still 10% sugar, but 90% cocoa is pretty hard to take if you're used to normal chocolate. But you can get there, because I think Lindt actually offer you versions that are like 65%, 75%, 85%, 90%. So you can actually, if you are finding it difficult to just stop with chocolate, you could over time work yourself up through those levels to the point where you could ultimately, if you're having 90% chocolate, it's probably not much of a treat, and you're not going to find it hard to give up.
No. And I know we're sort of getting off topic a bit, but I'm very, very excited, interested in that topic, obviously, and I think a lot of teens I'm speaking with 2-3 nutrition units will be very interested in some of your research behind that as well. Well, so I was just trying to get back to, so if I, for example, if I struggle to sleep, if I'm a bad
Yep.
sleeper now, my age, 49
Yep.
years old, and that, am I then more addicted to seek out something that gives me dopamine? Like, am I more chance of getting on my phone because I can't sleep?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
If I've got a lack of purpose, I'm more
Absolutely.
chance of getting on the phone to give me that dopamine hit.
I don't know about the lack of purpose, but so what causes you to not be able to sleep is the body's trying to generate enough dopamine to hit the level that the brain says you need because of the delta phos B level.
Yeah.
Now that delta phos B level is there for two reasons. One, you're suffering chronic stress of some description, or two, you're addicted, or three, I guess the third one is both, which is the normal state. So often what people do when they can't sleep is actually make the problem worse, in that they then start, they get on their phone or something like that, and that actually increases the delta phos B level and will make it harder to sleep the next night. What you've got to do is identify what's causing the dopamine, the delta phos B levels to be too high. Are you doing something addictive during the day? So, I mean, if we just think about a simple example here, most people can't sleep after chugging down 5 chocolates at 5 coffees at 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
You do 5 espressos at 8 o'clock at night. You're not going to be getting to sleep in a hurry, right? And that's because you've just taken something that gives you massive dopamine surges and then expected your body to go to sleep. It's just not going to happen. But a lot of people do the equivalent of that every day of the week. Kids in particular do something like that. They'll hop into bed, get on social media for 2 hours, which is the equivalent of ingesting 5 coffees and then trying to go to sleep. It's very, very difficult to do. What you have to do is try and get the brain to a state where it's not racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, where it's not seeking the dopamine surges, and then try to sleep.
So then what happens then if there's, again, my wife and I are working at night time, we have to all pens down by 10 o'clock or laptop away by 10 o'clock. Why then can we go to bed and she's asleep in 30 seconds and I'm still buzzing? Is it because my dopamine's charged up from the work I'm doing? Or is that's just a difference?
It could be. So remember, there's 2 sources of a delta phos B level that's too high. There's stress and there's addiction.
Okay.
And sometimes it's both. So if you're in I don't know anything about your life, but if there are stresses in your life, often there are stresses in people's lives around finances and so on. If there are stresses in your life, then they operate in exactly the same way as an addictive substance. They keep raising the delta phos B. If delta phos B is too high, then the brain thinks dopamine's not high enough, and you are unable to focus, which means your brain skips around constantly. Yeah. So you'd find that in the time where you're trying to go to sleep, if you stop and step out of your brain a bit and have a look at your, the last 5 minutes of recording of what you're doing and what you're thinking, you'll probably find you've bounced around from about, 10 different topics, thinking about a little bit about this and a little bit about that 100%. And a little bit about that, and focusing on nothing in particular, just bouncing it around. What you've got to do is find a way to focus on something and keep pulling it back to that focus. Keep pulling it back to, right, I'm focusing on this now. And every time it wanders and every time it tries to go off topic and do something else, you pull it back to that and focus on that. You probably find you're asleep in no time.
Okay. I'm going to try that now.
Now, it's the old counting sheep thing. I mean, there's some truth to the old wives' tales. Counting sheep, the idea was to focus on counting sheep. Now, there are probably more interesting things to focus on, but the key is to focus.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I had that with my daughter saying, she said, I can't sleep. I said, sometimes when I really struggle, I just count backwards from 300. And I said,
that's a way to do it.
I'm cooked. It must be so boring. It's like,
so the key is it's not so much that it's boring, it's that it requires you to stay on task.
Focus, right. Yeah.
If you jump on a counting task, it's obvious you've jumped because you've lost count. So that's why that works. Some people find that so unbelievably boring that they can't even stick to it. So, they'll find something else to focus on.
Is that why often it's recommended that people do mindfulness before bed, because it gives you that complete focus?
Yeah, it's clearing the brain, meditation, whatever you like. What you shouldn't be doing is something that requires you to think through a problem or calculate something or something. Doing that kind of thing is just a sure way to just keep your brain jumping.
Right, okay. Now, we touched a little bit last time about I was trying to get like some more effects of technology, but do you think technology has an effect on our teens' reality? Like I see a lot of teens walking around with, it seems like a lot of apathy. Do you think the addictive pathways have been changed so much that it does affect things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So most people, when they're not doing the addictive behavior, their brain thinks they have too little dopamine. Now, in boys, what that looks like is an inability to focus, which comes out as lots of physical movement. In girls, it comes out as daydreaming. So that, to a girl who has too little dopamine isn't going to be bouncing around the classroom. What she's going to be doing is, just not particularly thinking about anything, not focusing on what's going on, and not focusing on anything in particular, just bouncing around in her head. So, yeah, that could look like apathy.
Okay. All right. Now I'm going to jump around, if that's okay, just a few questions. Again, I find myself writing 1,000 notes while you're speaking to me, so I really appreciate the information you're giving. And obviously, if it affects people out there, I apologise in advance, but just so we all know, do you think there's the addiction, what does research say about it? If there's an addiction to technology, does that mean there's a more chance of an addiction to self-harm, suicide, that kind of stuff?
Well, so let's separate self-harm and suicide for starters. So self-harm is an addiction-like behaviour. So remember that I said to you that there are two ways to produce a delta phos-B elevation and to produce a dopamine surge. Now, one of the ways to produce a dopamine surge that isn't talked about much is pain. So your body reacts to pain by giving you a surge of dopamine. The reason remember I said before about runner's high and endorphins being released? Well, that's the body coping with the pain of running. So the body says, this is really painful. We need some painkillers. And it can produce its own called endorphins, which is a type of morphine. So that's what's actually producing the high. The same thing happens if you inflict pain. And so the idea of self-harm is actually an addictive behavior. So the delta phos-B is too low, a dopamine surge is required. The person discovers either by accident or by other people telling them that you feel better if you cut. And so they do feel better because it produces a dopamine surge. And now they could produce the same dopamine surge or something similar by taking a substance or by playing a game or by getting on social media. But if all of those things are not available, or they prefer a more intense surge, then you're in the space where that sort of self-harm is occurring. The research is pretty clear on this. Self-harm is not, in a strict sense, a precursor to suicide, because the person is not attempting to kill themselves. They're just attempting to cause pain to themselves.
To raise dopamine.
So now, suicide is a different thing altogether. The really comprehensive Australian study, which I go to in a lot of detail in Teen Brain. So I'd recommend anyone who's interested in this have a look at what I say about it in Teen Brain, but more importantly, read the study itself, which is of course referenced in Teen Brain. The reason it's an interesting study is whenever you start talking about suicide, there's a lot of people with a lot of stories and narratives that they feel explain these things. This child was bullied, or they used social media a lot and got a bad body image and that caused it. And there's a lot of stories like that. And that makes for good press. But what this study was trying to do was figure out, if we just do the proper statistical analysis on suicide, what are the things that we can say definitively are predictors of suicide? And they did that, and they did an excellent job, like really high quality Australian researchers with access to all the suicide data in Australia. And the end result was there was only one absolutely take it to the bank predictor of suicide, and that was depression.
Wow.
So forget about all the other stories and all the other causes that everyone comes up with about, family circumstances, blah, blah, blah. They went through, they analysed all of that and says statistically we cannot find a reliable link. The one thing that was an absolute reliable predictor was depression.
So, David,
every time someone commits suicide, the one thing you can say with certainty beforehand was that they were depressed.
So do you mind, just for the listeners out there again, just to quickly go over that, what does that mean with regard to dopamine levels, delta force B?
So
how does that depression again work? Yeah.
So depression is an outcome from so if we go back to the things we've been talking about earlier today about the delta force B and so on, and you might say, okay, so addiction raises delta force B or stress raises delta force B, and that causes the addiction or stress to have continuing bad effects in your life. But one of the bad effects it has is that if delta force B is too elevated for too long, then the brain changes the way it assesses risk. Mm-hmm. And this is critically important. If the brain assesses risk of the environment around you as being too high, it causes anxiety. And what happens is as delta force B gets higher and higher and higher, the calculation of risk gets more and more out of whack. So a person with really high delta force B has a terrible risk calculation in that they overestimate the danger of their environment in an extreme way. That flows through to another thing, which is what's called a disappointment calculation. These are actual mathematical. People have run simulations of these calculations in human brains, but the disappointment calculation is, I guess, if you're expecting a reward and you don't get a reward that's as good as you're expecting, you're disappointed. So eventually you get to the point where the delta force B calculation of how much dopamine you require is so high that nothing you can do will produce that much dopamine, and you are therefore disappointed by everything. If you are continuously disappointed, another way to say that is you're depressed, which is why, given that both of these are sourced from the delta force B level being too high, anxiety and depression are always comorbid. So a person with anxiety generally has depression and vice versa.
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about
now, if you allow that to go on for a long period of time, eventually you get to the point where the anxiety calculations about the environment are so severe that you have what is generally termed a psychotic break. Now, psychosis is generally an overestimation of the danger of other humans, so the intentions of others. So you are so massively overestimating the risks in the environment that you're so massively overestimating the dangers of others that you become psychotic. In other words, delusional about the dangers posed by others.
Yeah.
And if you have those psychotic breaks continuously, you'll ultimately be diagnosed as schizophrenic.
So just to go back on one of your analogies there, so say my delta force B is high, and I'm anxious because I'm thinking the environment is less safe than what it really is. I'm anxious about the environment. I'm worried about my danger and my past history might have.
Well, you're anxious about everything. You're anxious about everything. Now, psychologists and psychiatrists, etc., will divide all these anxieties up into all sorts of different things. I'll call it PTSD. They'll call it anxiety. They'll call it general anxiety disorder. I think there's like 9 different descriptions of anxiety, but it's all anxiety.
Yeah, so if my anxiety then is high because I feel like the environment's more risky, is it because I don't produce enough dopamine to hit my delta force B that makes me then depressed? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, yeah. I'm just trying to work out how I can be so anxious, but then that's counted as depression, not anxiety. It's because of
it's both.
Yeah.
No, it's both.
Okay.
It's both. So you are both nervous, anxious, if you like, and disappointed / depressed.
Right. So then how does eating disorders fit in with that? Does eating disorders also fit in with more technology addiction, or is that completely different?
Completely different.
Okay.
One of the interesting things is people have tended to make that leap, right? Have tended to say, oh, well, people with eating, let's just avoid the term eating disorders, because it's a catch-all phrase that's getting a larger and larger group of things gathered under it.
Okay.
Let's go back to the original one, the one that people originally referred to when they're talking about an eating disorder, and that's anorexia,
Yep.
which is by far and away the most dangerous eating disorder.
And it's very prevalent in our schools. It's gone rife. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and but its incidence hasn't actually increased significantly until the last probably 10 years or so.
Yeah, okay.
And because of that, people have tended to say, well, anxiety is increasing around the same time frame. They must be related. So the anxiety and the anorexia must be related. And the anxiety is causing the anorexia or something like that. And so that's certainly one of the popular theories about these things.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced about that, because there's some important European studies that show that statistically you can't say that. That whilst it might sort of feel right, statistically it isn't borne out by the numbers, in that whilst, yes, anxiety is increasing, and yes, anorexia is increasing, anorexia isn't actually increasing that much, and by no means is it increasing at the rate that anxiety is increasing. And so there's a break in the statistics there that suggests that they are not in fact related. So it's an interesting area, and there's a lot of theories about it. The one I'm most taken with is the one that says that anorexia may in fact be an interesting case of reverse addiction. Now that might take some explaining. But if you imagine a scenario, where you're deprived of dopamine stimulus in an extreme way. So something occurs, say for example, you get very, very sick and are unable to eat during that sickness. And so your appetite's destroyed and you get no pleasure from eating. Now, this is a fundamental driver of dopamine surges in humans. It's one of the ones that keeps us high. Remembering that the purpose of our reward system is to keep us alive.
Yeah.
It's to give us a dopamine surge to motivate us to do things which keep us alive, like eat and have sex.
Yeah.
So the have sex doesn't keep us alive, but it makes sure there's another generation to follow on.
Yeah.
So that's the purpose of the system, and addiction is just a corruption of that system, where you overstimulate the dopamine system. So imagine though a scenario where, for whatever reason, you get to a point where you don't receive any dopamine stimulation from, say, eating or any pleasure at all.
Mm-hmm.
You then could enter into a cascade that was the reverse for delta phos-B, where, for example, so delta phos-B says, so say a normal person needs 5 hits of dopamine and they have a meal and they get 5 hits of dopamine and they feel satisfied and they're full, and so the amount of dopamine matches the amount of food that their body needs, and it's all good. And that's most of us most of the time, right?
Yep.
But imagine for whatever reason that delta phos-B level has been messed with because of, say, a period of illness, and the requirement for delta phos-B says we need a 1 unit level of dopamine hit, but the body says, no, we still need the 5 units of food. So the body's saying we're hungry, we need food, but the brain's saying, nah, we only need one hit of dopamine. So you have that first mouthful, there's your hit of dopamine. Brain says we're done. Body says, hang on a sec, we're not done. But the brain says, no, I'm calling the shots here, we're done. And if you do that, then you are understimulating delta phos-B, and what will happen is that delta phos-B ratchets down again the next time. So now the brain only needs half a unit.
Yeah.
And the body still says, hey, hang on, we still need 5. The brain says, no, I only need half. So it's a theory, but it is borne out by some interesting drug research which seems to simulate this. And I haven't written much about this in any of the books that I've written. I wrote a little passage about this in Teen Brain, but there'll be more about this in the next book I'm writing, where there'll be a chapter dedicated to this. But the theory is that if you get to that point, then you are in a spiral where you are not going to correct it. In the same way, in a way, it's a reverse addiction, in that every exposure to dopamine is too little. Delta phosphate keeps getting lower and lower and lower, and the body is starving because it's not getting enough food to stay alive. And what I've just described there is anorexia. And it matches what we know about anorexia, which is that when the BMI drops below about 17, it's very, very hard to get someone back without force feeding. Now, force feeding is overriding that brain signal that is saying, we're done, we've got enough. It's saying, we don't care what the brain thinks, we're going to put enough nutrition into this body to keep it alive. And the idea of force feeding is to get that BMI up above 19, which is what the research suggests is once you've got them back up above 19, then delta phosphate will start to get to a level where it starts to come back to normal. So the interesting thing here is the cause of anorexia may in fact be sickness or starvation forced upon a person some other way, like warfare or et cetera, et cetera. But if you get that period of 2 to 3 months of insufficient nutrition and the BMI starts to drop and it drops below 17, you may enter this state of what I would call reverse addiction, where the brain is shutting down food consumption way before the body needs it to.
I'm just trying to think why you're saying that too, but I know a lot of times that we hear when students come to the office talking about, like, under the wellbeing heading, they come in and they just talk about how there's they're the under the 500 calorie club, and they're part of a group where they feel, I've only had one apple today and I'm actually winning. Like, surely.
So there's lots of ways. There's lots of ways you could get to that state, but but I think we don't want to fixate on how you get to that state. The more important question is, how do you get out of that state? So understanding what that state is and how delta phosphate is related to it could in fact help. And so, for example, anecdotally, or if you read Cosmo, you'll see stories in there about people who say they cured their anorexia by using drugs, and not by, getting pharmaceuticals, by, smoking weed and so on. And that's interesting because what they're in fact saying is, I was getting dopamine hits from something else to push my delta phosphate back up again.
Yeah, right. So
not suggesting this as a cure to anorexia, but that's what you'll get from reading Cosmo, which may in fact be a glimpse into the truth.
Yeah, right. I'm looking forward to this next book coming out. When does that come out?
Oh, it'll be ages away. It won't be till next year yet.
Okay. Yeah, okay, if we jump around a bit more now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right. How does ADHD start if there's no addiction to technology?
Well, it'd be stress. The traditional ADHD. When ADHD was first diagnosed, which was in the 1930s, the kids that were being diagnosed with it were kids that were in terrible circumstances. So the Great Depression had hit in the United States. There were often, 10, 12 kids in a household. The father had no job. It was an extremely stressful situation. So there was chronic stress in the household 24 hours a day. Those were the kids that were ending up in hospitals and so on with diagnoses that ultimately, they were diagnosed with hyperactivity disorder or something like that, but what they were being diagnosed as is what we'd call ADHD today. So what was causing it in those kids was not addiction. They weren't addicted to anything. They weren't gaming too much in 1933. What was causing it was chronic stress. And they found when they put those kids in those homes and played around with things, they ultimately found that if you gave them speed, amphetamines, it fixed them for 4 hours. And so the net result of that is that the cure for ADHD is to give someone a dopamine stimulating drug. By the way, that's what Ritalin is. It's an amphetamine. So it doesn't cure anything. It provides temporary relief because if you think about it, it's actually going to drive delta phosphate levels even higher. But momentarily, for the 4 hours that it's effective, it does. It puts a person back in a state where they can think clearly because their brain's not jumping around all over the spot because their dopamine levels are too low.
So is that why?
Because remember what dopamine does. What dopamine does is give you focus. All right. So its purpose is to focus the brain. If delta phosphate says you haven't got enough, then you can't remain focused. So ADHD is a direct consequence of an environment. Well, initially where you were exposed to chronic stress. These days, much less likely, much more likely, it's an environment where you're exposed to addiction. Stress and addiction produce the same result.
And so you'd say that people who've been through trauma, then more chances of having ADHD then, because the cortisol levels are up, the testosterone goes up.
Yeah. Well, not so much an incident of trauma, more chronic. The chronic is the important part of this. So some really interesting experiments, I don't know which book I talked about this, it might have been Brain Reset.
Yeah.
Interesting experiments with rats where they actually induced ADHD in rats by stressing them. So and the way they stress rats, by the way, is that they put their cages on an angle, they made their bedding wet, they played loud music, they flashed lights 24 hours a day, and they stressed them. Yeah. So they were subject to chronic stress. They measured their delta phos B levels. They're exactly the same as rats, which they'd addicted to cocaine, and they found the same levels of inability to focus. So, inattentiveness.
Yeah, wow. That's mad. What about, here's a question for you, how about how does technology affect people who may be on the spectrum, say with ASD, autism?
Yeah, well.
And it's the reason why I asked that for. There's a reason Dave asked that for, because, and it could be, you might enlighten me with some different research here, but a lot of times the students I'm working with, and I'll look at their profile, and a lot of them will be, in their learning enrichment centre, and they need extra support and extra learning, which is great. Happy to help support and understand them more. But, there's a likes and dislikes column, and I'm trying to relate to them, connect with them. Likes gaming. And I'm just like, surely that can't be the right thing for someone who's got ASD.
Yeah. I think I've got to be careful about talking about this because this does cross over a little bit with my day job. So I've got to, let's say there's been a lot of diagnosis creep with ASD since 2013 when the DSM-5 changed the definitions, removed the diagnosis of Asperger's. And so there used to be two different diagnoses. There used to be autism, or what would be called ASD level 3 today, and there used to be, which is essentially ASD with an intellectual disability. I think the criteria for autism under the old DSM was, I think you had to have an intellectual impairment, IQ less than 70. Okay. And then there was the condition Asperger's, which was not any of those things. They were perfectly normal people with perfectly normal jobs, software engineers, et cetera, who had difficulty interacting socially. So had difficulty reading other people. And the classic diagnosis of that says that they were high in emotional empathy, low in, or had no cognitive empathy. So what that meant is that they could read your emotions, they could feel your emotions, they understood what you were doing and saying, even without you saying it. They could feel your emotions, they could feel you were negative about them or positive about them. They didn't know why. So they had no cognitive empathy, so no ability to analyze the situation and understand why you were pumping out the emotions that they could feel. So a person with Asperger's was given a lot of strategies for how to figure out what was going on in their day-to-day life and allow them to react normally, because often the situation with an Asperger's person was that what caused them problems is that they didn't react normally. So a person, they'd react overly aggressively to a request or misunderstood the social situation. So now that's been messed up a bit by DSM-5, which has imported this notion of everyone is autistic, essentially, or everyone who would have previously been diagnosed as Asperger's is now diagnosed as autism. Either level 1 or level 2. So on the spectrum. Now, the difficulty is that I think there's a lot of diagnosis creep there, and the answer to your question is people with those conditions. With the exception of level 3, but we say level 1 or level 2 under the current definitions, do not have materially different brains from the perspective of the things we've been talking about here today.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just as capable of addiction as anybody else,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just as capable of delta phos B being out of whack as anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I probably improperly excluded level 3 because we just don't know
Mm-hmm.
there, because the level of disruption in the brain is so significant that there's been very little research done in that respect there. But I think you could probably reasonably safely say that someone who would previously have been diagnosed with Asperger's, but who might now be diagnosed as level 1 or level 2, probably has pretty much the same brain setup when it comes to risk reward and delta phos B and the other things we've been talking about as anybody else.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so no difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
So not more at risk, not less at risk.
No, okay. Yeah, 'cause I guess I was sort of thinking about how we try and teach more social cues and that kind of stuff, and I thought like being addicted to games, for example, would be one of the worst things we can try and do.
Well, I think they're unrelated in the sense that a person with ASD level 1 or 2 or Asperger's under the old money has a difficulty with overactive emotional empathy and underactive cognitive empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And neither of those things have anything to do with the addiction pathways.
Okay. Interesting. That's interesting, yeah. All right. Here's some more. I've nearly finished here, so appreciate all the topics you've been covering tonight. The scenario of a technology detox. We've educated some parents out there. They're like, oh my gosh, like me, I know too much now. I actually want to be vigilant now to try and, help my little Johnny or Jill on the right track. What does it look like? Is it like you said, find an instrument, find a sport, try and find something else? And if that's the case, like you said, what are some of the behaviours that we can expect to see when the kids are detoxing?
Oh, the same behaviours you'd expect to see if you took the drugs away from a drug addict.
Yeah, wow.
So there'll be a violent reaction against it. They will be unpleasant about it. If they're a 14-year-old boy, they'll probably be physically unpleasant about it, which is the main thing that stops people doing this. They don't want to get punched by their kid. They don't want their kid ranting and raving and freaking out. And that's exactly what will happen. It is exactly what would happen if you took alcohol away from an alcoholic, and it's what will happen if you take games away from a gamer or social media away from a teenage girl.
So the strategies that parents can use to ensure their children don't get addicted, is that basically limited? Well,
I mean, don't get addicted is easy. Don't expose someone to things that cause addiction. If they're already addicted, which is the more probable scenario, then understand you are going to have an ugly bit. And the good news is it will end. And every day that you get through it will be better than the day before.
Yeah. Yes, there's hope out there, obviously.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, Dave, like honest, in a world that we live in now, a technological world we live in now, is there ever anything that's going to trump technology? Because you're talking about before about, for example, runners high, you can exercise.
But we're not talking about technology in any real sense. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a screen. There's nothing wrong with a laptop. There's nothing wrong with a computer. They're all perfectly functional tools and very helpful. What we're talking about is a very, very small minority of apps that are explicitly written for the sole purpose of creating addiction. And you might say, well, why would someone do that? Well, because these apps are free. They cost billions of dollars to make. They cost billions of dollars to maintain, but they're free. And they have hundreds of thousands of competitors. The one who makes the app the most competitive wins. Sorry, the most addictive wins. It's that simple. That's why they do it. But we're not talking about all apps. Most of the things on a computer, most of the things on a screen are not addictive in any way. It's just a very small class of ones that dominate the discourse and which are designed with the sole purpose of addiction.
Yeah, but you said that, but also earlier you said that even group messages can be addictive. So that's not really...
Well, yeah, but that's a small app. So in that you're talking about messaging. Most people are using Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small group of apps. It's maybe 5 apps that dominate that environment. And yes, they're addictive, but it's possible to have a laptop without them.
Yeah. All right. Well, my last question for you. You're going to give me some hope here, hopefully. All the educators out there, how do we keep our students focused? We sort of touched a little bit last time. You talked about boys being more kinesthetic, for example, in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
But with a generation now who you said last time was, the chances are you've got a classroom full of addicts. How do educators actually get the kids to focus? Is it about chop and changing content within a lesson? Is it about having more of a hook? Is it more about having story to get the kids engaged? Do you have an opinion on that one?
Look, it's a difficult proposition, because what you're saying in essence is, I get this kid for 60, 70 minutes a day, and the rest of their day is full of dopamine hits.
Yeah, that's right.
and I want to remove the dopamine hits and have them focus on what I need them to focus on in my classroom. And boy, that's a big ask. That is really a big ask. But let's just say some of the rules of the way a brain works.
Okay.
You are more likely to get someone to produce the required dopamine for focus if they have to solve a problem.
Okay.
So lecturing them is the opposite of that. Okay.
Yeah, no,
talking at them will produce nothing. Their brain will be thinking about anything other than what you are saying. So if you want them to focus on what you're saying, don't say it to them. Get them to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Doing is about problem solving, and that's a way to produce dopamine.
Okay. I'm just trying to think of some of the subjects out there that people teach, and you'll always have people going, "Oh, it's okay. It's different for a sports teacher, or different for that." But it's also about trying to get those kids. So I suppose.
But any subject has doing aspects to it. I mean, you might say, "Well, what hope have I got? I'm a history teacher. What do we do? Go and invade Poland?" Yeah, that's doing. But maybe a different way to do it is to think about a problem that illustrates something about what you're teaching and get them to solve it without telling them what the historical answer is until the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it's more inquiry-based stuff. Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else that I've missed that you'd like to shed light on? I mean,
there's always many things. We can always do it again some other time. You'll probably get some more questions, or we can talk about some of the other things. Yeah,
well, I obviously appreciate your time, and I said it's a massive learning curve still for myself, and I know a lot of educators out there and parents are definitely tuning in to listening to some of the feedback that you've got and your experience based on your research. So we're all grateful for that. Before you do go, can I just ask just quickly the book you're working on at the moment?
Yeah. So it's I think did I not mention this last time?
You mentioned last time about all the things that we believe is true, but maybe not.
Contrary to popular belief is my working title.
Nice.
And what it is a book of things that are not long enough to be books.
Nice.
So the thing about anorexia, there's another one about sunscreens. There's a bunch of chapters that are. There's probably going to end up being about 10 of them, which are where I get to drill down a bit to the extent that some of the things we've been talking about here. But I think if I were to try to make a book out of one of those things, I'd find it tedious, and probably so would the reader. So it's about things that are interesting and wrong, but talking about that. So, for example, the thing about anorexia, talking about what's the current mythology around it, and what are some interesting alternative takes on it, such as the delta phos-B one.
And it must be like pretty exciting for you to actually finding out this research, the things you're looking at the moment, like.
Oh yeah, it's things that I've come across at times in the past, and maybe even obliquely referenced here and there, but have never really dug in deep on it and written thoroughly about the topic.
Okay, all right. And how you find time to do this? I want to know. I know you said last time, well, I don't watch Netflix or movies. I do research, but is that where you find most of your book writing time? Is it morning before day job? Is it after?
No, it's morning. So I get up at 4:30 every morning.
Wow.
And that gives me a solid 2 hours. I mean, just a general tip for your listeners is the way that we can talk about sleep in more depth, perhaps the next time we talk. But one of the things that happens during sleep is your brain gets a thorough cleaning. So it's like putting it through a car wash. And a lot of the crap that gets in there and stops it thinking properly after a day of burning, fatty acids, which is what it does, is cleaned out. So the best time to think about anything and be your absolute sharpest is immediately after you wake up. And the worst time to think about anything or do anything that requires thinking is immediately before you go to sleep.
There you go.
So if you want to do some hardcore thinking, do it after you wake up. And if you've got to do an exam, do it first thing in the morning. Because your brain is at its absolute best. And the difference in performance cognitively between first thing in the morning and late at night is very significant.
Is it really?
So there's been some research that's tried to put it in equivalent to alcohol, and basically you're drunk by nighttime in terms of your cognitive performance. You're about 0.05, and you're unlikely to be able to do your best work cognitively at that time.
That's great. So you must at least go to bed early, surely, to get enough for all the work.
Yeah, I'm out like a light by 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah, wow. No, it's just interesting to see how you fit all your stuff in. Like someone told me one day, if you want to get something done, you give it to a busy person. So
I do things where I don't have to think much, like this podcast.
Well, it's easy for you.
At this time of night.
I'm burning over trying to understand. Next time I'm going to have this podcast at 4:30 in the morning. Now I've got you.
That's right. Yeah, it'll be even sharper.
It'll be easier for me to understand. I won't ask you so many silly questions to understand it. Yeah, right.
Well, I recommend if people are listening to this and thinking, this is doing my head in, well, try listening to it first thing in the morning. It might be easier.
No, look, it's fantastic. And Dave, again, I know it's over now, but I really do appreciate your time. I know you're doing it for free.
Absolute pleasure.
It's so important, I think, for our generation out there, for parents as well as, all of us. And I think everyone gets something out of that. And I know I surely do, and I really appreciate your time.
Absolute pleasure. I'm sure we'll speak again, Gary.
Well, I hope we can talk about maybe about sweet poison and maybe sleep and diet next time, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. No worries at all.
All right, mate. Thanks very much for your time.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Gary. See you later.